Russia's vast and challenging geography and history had been Putin's greatest military advantage until now. But this time, history is taking a ruthless revenge on Putin's Russia. Russia has always been a community that has destroyed itself from within. Putin's real nightmare would be his own people rising up against the regime, freezing to death on the streets of Moscow or St. Petersburg. He had two fundamental shields he relied on to prevent this nightmare. One was geographical, the other was underground. The geographical shield was the legendary myth of general distance, which defeated Napoleon and Hitler. Russia's infinite vastness was a shield that would swallow any enemy. The underground shield was the myth of invincibility, where the most valuable strategic reserves were stored in untouchable underground facilities, far from enemy fire. These two myths were symbols of Russia's geographical and industrial power. Neither Napoleon nor Hitler could overcome this. They did it not with their armies, but with general winter and general distance. This legendary doctrine ended with Ukraine's asymmetric attacks. That geographical shield, stretching for thousands of kilometers, turned into a defensive nightmare against cheap, long-range drones. And these drones did more than just pierce the shield. 1,000 kilometers beyond the border, they struck Kanchurinsk, the winter weapon, the underground fortress Putin relied on to keep his people warm. This time, history did not repeat itself. It had turned against Putin. Both the shield and that winter weapon were destroyed simultaneously in a single operation. Putin was now left alone with his greatest fear, the wrath of his own people. So, what were the first moments of this historic collapse, this strategic disaster? Let's go back to the night of October 29th, 2025, to the moment that nightmare began. This is not a drill. This is the sound of a collapse echoing in the heart of Russia, more than 1,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Explosions were reported to be heard 8 kilometers away, turning the sky into a war zone. What you see here is hell itself, the Kanchurinsk underground gas storage facility, UGS, in Bashkortostan. This is no ordinary industrial facility. It was the very strategic reserve that the Kremlin touted as its winter weapon, one of the largest in Europe. It was the very facility that the Russian state agency, TASS, proudly announced just 19 days ago, on October 10th, was ready for winter and completely full. The explosion that occurred on the night of October 29th, 2025, deeply shook not only a storage facility, but also Putin's promise that Russia is safe, we will get through the winter without problems, and his strategic depth doctrine. This went down in history as one of the most brutal instances of war coming home. Interestingly, there was a serious cover-up about the incident in the Kremlin, the strike on the winter weapon in Bashkortostan. This is proof of ultimate weakness. The Russian Ministry of Defense, MOD, released a success report that same night, claiming that over 100 UAVs had been shot down. The report listed Bryansk, Stavropol Krai, and several other regions. It stated that operations had been suspended at 13 airfields. However, not a single word was mentioned about the gas facility in Bashkortostan, where the strategic winter weapon was located, which was hit more than 1,000 kilometers deep. The strike on the reserve, which TASS described as full, could make it difficult for Russia to balance its reserves due to low temperatures. This is because the Kanchurinsk UGS is a key balancing point in Russia's unified gas supply system. Especially in winter, when demand peaks on the main pipelines from Siberia, this storage facility kicks in to provide gas pressure to millions of homes and industrial facilities in European Russia and the Urals. Now this facility is gone or severely damaged. The result? Gas pressure drops. Compensating for this loss in low temperatures is nearly impossible. This situation sets off a domino effect. Heating systems fail, factories shut down, and power generation is disrupted. This means millions of Russian citizens face the risk of freezing in the middle of winter. This is the real reason why the Kremlin is saying negative things about Bashkortostan. Putin fears his own people freezing to death and rioting in the streets of Moscow or St. Petersburg, far more than he fears NATO missiles or tanks. What happened that night in Kanchurinsk was just the tip of the iceberg. This was not an isolated singular attack. It was a ruthlessly coordinated, four-pronged industrial strangulation operation targeting Russia's strategic depth. On the morning of October 29th, the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces, SSO, unhesitatingly claimed responsibility. According to the Kyiv Post, the SSO confirmed that they had carried out a comprehensive campaign against Russia's oil and gas infrastructure that night, under the title, One Night, Three Major Targets. This announcement, combined with reports that the winter weapon in Bashkortostan had been hit, painted a picture that looked like a security fiasco for the Kremlin. The targets officially confirmed by the SSO were the lifeblood of the Russian war economy and the home front. First, the Stavrolan/Budyonovsk complex, located approximately 700 kilometers deep in Stavropol Krai, was hit. This facility is a massive petrochemical center owned by Lukoil, linked to oligarch Vagit Alekperov. It was not just a refinery, but also a vital center producing critical polymers and industrial gases needed by the Russian army. The strike on the facility directly targeted not only fuel production, but also the supply chain for special materials needed for military equipment. The second and third legs of the operation aimed to take out two more critical refineries that fed Russia's domestic fuel market. The Mariisk oil refinery in the Mari El Republic, with an annual processing capacity of 1.6 million tons, was a major supplier in the region. Simultaneously, the Novospassky oil refinery in the Ulyanovsk Oblast was also ablaze. This facility, owned by NS Oil, played a critical role, particularly in the production of diesel and gasoline. Ukrinform and other media outlets reported that the targeting of these two facilities was a strategic move that would further deepen the fuel crisis, already affecting a significant portion of the Russian population. However, an even greater admission than the targeting of these four strategic facilities was the collapse of the Russian civil aviation system that night. The shockwave created by these coordinated strikes paralyzed Russian airspace control. The Russian aviation authority Rosaviatsia was forced to suspend operations at a total of 13 airports, including the three major airports in Moscow, Vnukovo, Domodedovo, Sheremetyevo, in an unprecedented decision. This was not merely a technical security measure. It was a clear indication that Russian air defense had lost control even around the capital, a moment of panic and the collapse of civilian logistics. Hundreds of flights were cancelled, thousands of passengers were stranded in terminals, and the "everything is under control" propaganda was crushed under the chaos on the airport tarmac. This situation can be considered one of the most concrete proofs of state weakness and the loss of airspace control. To read this quadruple attack on the night of October 29th as merely a military operation is to miss a large part of the picture. To understand why the shockwave created by these attacks was so devastating, one must look at the current state of health of the body that these blows fell upon, namely the Russian domestic front. These attacks did not fall upon a healthy body, but upon a weak constitution that had already been struggling with a high fever for months and showing signs of failure in multiple organs. October 29th was a can of gasoline poured on accumulated anger and systemic collapse. First, Russia had been grappling with a chronic fuel crisis for months. This crisis was a direct result of Ukraine systematically targeting refineries throughout the year. According to reports from think tanks such as the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, and information relayed by the Kyiv Post, previous attacks had disabled more than 20% of Russia's refinery capacity. This triggered a gasoline and diesel shortage that directly affected more than 70% of the population. Fuel queues stretching for miles, reminiscent of the final days of the Soviet Union, became some of the most shared images on social media. While the public listened to stories of victory on the front lines, they experienced the contradiction of not being able to find fuel for their cars in their daily lives. The bombing of the Mariisk and Novospassky refineries on October 29th was like pouring fuel on the existing fire. Secondly, Russian infrastructure, especially in regions close to the border, was literally crumbling. Oblast regions such as Belgorod and Bryansk had become accustomed to chronic power outages due to constant attacks on transformer stations and power distribution lines. With winter approaching, these outages meant not just discomfort, but a struggle for survival. The infrastructure scandal in Podolsk, near Moscow, last winter, which left tens of thousands of people without heating in freezing temperatures, remained fresh in people's memories. The state's inability to provide heating, even in a city right next to the capital, showed how fragile the system was. Thirdly, a water crisis had been added to this energy crisis. Previous attacks on dams and water treatment plants in Belgorod had not only created a flood risk, but also jeopardized the region's drinking water supply security. The people had to add the possibility of thirst to the list of fuel and electricity shortages. Finally, all this infrastructural collapse was compounded by severe economic devastation, sanctions, increased war spending, and the hundreds of thousands of men taken from the workforce by the secret mobilization had pushed inflation to its highest level in 14 years. Rising taxes and price increases for basic necessities were making the burden on the people unbearable. It was against this backdrop that the winter weapon in Bashkortostan struck on the night of October 29th. A people who had already seen Putin's promise of stability collapse, who were without fuel, electricity and economically exhausted, now faced the risk of freezing in the middle of winter. This was the kind of catalyst that could turn pent-up anger into a mutiny. Now let's take a step back and analyze. Let's combine the Kanchurinsk explosion with this current internal crisis we've detailed. Why was an underground gas storage facility the most critical of the 4 different targets? And why did the Kremlin struggle so desperately to cover up this particular attack? The answer lies in the timing of this attack and the strategic choice of target. This was not a random target. It was one of the most sophisticated and ruthless applications of the logistical strangulation doctrine. Let's look at evidence 1. On October 10, 2025, just 19 days before the attack, the Russian state agency, TASS, proudly announced that the Kanchurinsk underground gas storage facility, UGS, was completely filled and ready for winter. This was a propaganda message to the Russian people. No matter what the West does to us, your homes will be warm. Evidence 2. Ukraine's choice of October 29th to carry out the attack. OSINT analysts and military experts suggest that Ukraine anticipated the facility boasting about being completely full and struck it at full capacity to inflict maximum damage. Now let's draw our conclusion. This storage facility was not an ordinary gas reserve. It was Russia's winter weapon. The Kanchurinsk UGS was Gazprom's insurance policy for balancing the system during extreme cold in winter, when demand peaks. As mentioned earlier, this strategic reserve was expected to kick in when the already fragile power grid collapsed or heating systems failed, as in Podolsk. This is where the strategic logic of this attack lies. With the facility being hit, the possibility arose that a significant portion of this strategic reserve could be lost. This means that gas pressure could fall below critical levels during the winter months. This in turn could trigger a chain reaction, leading to the collapse of regional heating systems. A population already without fuel and electricity now faces the risk of freezing in their homes in the middle of winter. This is a scenario that could trigger internal political chaos and potentially ignite a spark of rebellion. We now better understand why the Kremlin fell into a deep silence about Bashkortostan on the morning of October 29th. Putin may fear his own people freezing to death and rising up against the regime more than he fears NATO missiles. This silence was not an admission of weakness, but of fear. The potential for civil panic created by Kanchurinsk was only one side of the equation. That same night, 700 kilometers away, the strike on the Lukoil facility in Stavropol showed how multi-layered and well-planned this strategic strangulation operation was. They targeted not only the people, but also the very foundation of the war machine. Let's continue our analysis. War is not won by fuel alone. Modern warfare is also waged with materials, especially petrochemical products. The fact that Ukraine targeted not only refineries in this attack, but also a petrochemical and gas processing facility, such as Stavrolan/Budyonovsk, may indicate that the strategy has evolved to a new stage. Let's look at the evidence. According to Lukoil's official press releases, the Stavrolan facility is one of Russia's largest polymer producers. The facility's production data indicates an annual capacity of approximately 319,000 tons of high-density polyethylene and 113,000 tons of polypropylene. The Budyonovsk gas processing plant, GPP, which was hit at the same time, has an annual gas processing capacity of 2.2 billion cubic meters. What do these figures mean? These polymers, polyethylene and polypropylene, are invisible but vital components of the modern war machine. They are used everywhere, from cable insulation in military equipment to soldiers' helmets, from drone bodies to protective coatings for electronic warfare systems. Gas processing plants not only heat homes, but also provide the energy and raw materials necessary for these complex chemical production processes. Now let's draw a conclusion. This is a different strategy from an FPV drone attack hitting a tank on the front lines. This is hitting the factory that produces the special plastic that tank needs, or the plant that produces the industrial gas that factory needs to operate. This may indicate that Ukraine is now targeting not just Russia's war machine, but the very foundation of Russia's war economy. This is a slower, less visible, but in the long run, much more destructive strangulation strategy. It is an industrial attrition war aimed at making Russia unable to produce the basic materials it needs to repair its pipelines, lay new cables, or feed its industry. The events of the night of October 29th point to a psychological and strategic rupture that runs deeper than the military impact. The real target of these attacks may have been not just gas storage facilities or polymer factories, but the very empire of lies upon which the Kremlin is built. The regime's response to this disaster, namely panic, cover-up, and denial, became part of this psychological warfare. This was a strategic checkmate move that undermined all of Putin's security doctrines in a single night. The first step in this checkmate move is the death of Russia's strategic depth myth. Ukraine's cheap, hard-to-detect drones, with a range of over 1,000 kilometers, have turned Russia's geographical advantage into a defensive nightmare. There is now a vast area to defend, and every point in that area is a potential target. But even more devastating than the collapse of this doctrine is the piercing of the regime's propaganda shield. The Kremlin's response to this crisis has revealed a familiar web of lies. Let's look at the evidence, namely the Lavrov archive. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has served as the regime's international face for years. Lavrov said in 2008, "We will not attack Georgia," and Russian tanks rolled into Tbilisi. Lavrov said in 2014, "We have no troops in Crimea," and the "little green men" annexed the peninsula. In February 2022, Lavrov said, "We will not attack Ukraine, this is Western hysteria," and days later, the invasion began. Let's draw a conclusion. Just as Lavrov has systematically lied to the world for years, on October 29th, the same propaganda machine turned inward. The Russian Ministry of Defense, MOD, boasted about shooting down 100 UAVs, lying to its own people by not saying a word about Bashkortostan, where the greatest disaster occurred. Stavropol Governor Vladimirov lied to his own citizens, saying, "There is no significant damage," while images of massive fires leaked onto the internet. The point is this: the system is now too fragile to bear the truth. The truth is this: a swarm of UAVs can fly 1,000 kilometers deep into Russia, bypass all air defenses, the closure of 13 airfields being the greatest proof of this bypass, and strike the country's strategic winter weapon. This simple truth alone undermines the entire doctrine of Putin's regime, built on security and stability. The last air defense system left in the Kremlin's hands is the lies it tells its own people. As you can see, Russia's strategic depth appears to have evaporated. Putin's winter weapon has been hit. The heart of the war economy has been targeted. 13 airports have been locked down. And the Kremlin's only response to this security fiasco has been to tell its own people, already without fuel, electricity, and in the cold, the same lies that Lavrov told the world. This could mark a new and brutal phase of the war. The war is no longer confined to the front lines. The war has come to Russia's own doorstep. Thank you for choosing us.